Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Hello, it's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. Thank you all for the invite and for putting this on. Oh, great. Thank you so much. This is me. But before I talk about me and my own work, I just want to start by saying that I think there's no better place in Europe to talk about design and what it means to be a designer and to talk perhaps about the next generation of designers than Belgrade. I know so many of my friends and colleagues all across Europe are very, very inspired by the movement that has been occurring here for the last few months. I just want to acknowledge the courage all across this city and this country of so many people. It's not easy. This is not an easy fight, even though you know that you're not alone because you bring literally tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people with you on the streets here. I know sometimes it can feel a bit like the rest of the world maybe doesn't care that much. I'm just here to say that we do, and we are watching. And I also wanted to put this at the very front because, to be honest, I'm going to attempt for the next 20 minutes or so to talk about my own work and what I learned about what it means to be a designer in this world, but I really feel like the people of Serbia could teach me and us perhaps much more than I could ever bring here. And also, all of the Next Gen Design people and all of your wonderful work that you see exhibited out there, I was very inspired to look through all the projects, and I feel like you could also teach me much more about the work that you do. So I just want to put this as a preface at the very beginning of my talk. I'm still going to try and attempt to talk about my work and my thoughts and feelings about all of this for the next 20 minutes or so, and then I'm happy to open it to questions as well. So, who am I? This is me. I don't know exactly how old I was on this photograph. But I like this photograph, and I found it again 3 years ago, because I always have a slightly hard time explaining to people what I do and putting it on a business card. But this sort of encompasses it in a wonderful way, which is I spend most of my time, waking time, in front of a screen. And if I do my job right, hopefully it feels a bit magical. If you can't tell, this is a magician's costume that I'm wearing. I think it was around Carnival, but then I decided to just wear the magician's costume for a whole year, because who wouldn't want to be a magician? And if I do my job right, whether it's on a screen or in my activism or whatever I do, hopefully other people get touched by it, get inspired by it, whatever it might be. Hopefully it feels a bit like magic. And really, this is still what I do today. So I'm a designer. I spend most of my time in front of screens. But I wasn't always a designer, and I didn't always know that I wanted to be a designer. And like many of you, I'm sure we all have our sort of heroes and people that we look up to when we first start out as teenagers. And this is one of my heroes. This is Tina Roth-Eisenberg. She's a Swiss-born and now New York-based designer. And when I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to be as a teenager, I looked at a lot of design talks at design conferences. And she gave a lot of them at various conferences, and she had this sentence in her talks, which is, I have a rule. If I keep complaining about something, I either do something about it or I let it go. And I really like this quote because it has, I think, inspired me maybe unconsciously for a very long time. Now, I know this comes from a place of privilege, right? There are many things one can complain about which we don't have the power over to change necessarily, and politics is a great example. I think it's totally fine to complain about politics, and I think actually complaining, and I'll look at the sentence slightly different than I did back then, because now I actually think complaining is quite useful at times as well. But I do think it sort of encompasses a way of looking at the world and of looking at design not so much as sort of a toolkit of tools like using colors, using materials, using these kinds of processes to create things, but really more of a way of looking at the world and looking at the problems in the world and trying to fix them. I think design to me is really a tool for problem solving. And in my own work, I try to do this, and I brought as a very recent example my trip here to Belgrade, because I tried to not fly within Europe. And the reason why I look slightly tired is because that meant I took a 20-hour bus ride to get here, because there's no good train connections available in many parts of Europe. And so one of the projects that I did last year, for example, with Greenpeace, was try and visualize train connections from various parts of Europe and possible train connections. And we built an interactive tool, that's just a screenshot of it, that really shows which train connections we would need to make and where we would need to construct the infrastructure to actually bring Europe closer together. And this was then brought to Brussels and talked about with policymakers. I also worked with Greenpeace last year to build a private jet tracker where we started tracking sort of like Flight Radar 24, but just just for Austrian registered private jets. And we looked at all of them and looked where they were going and calculated how much CO2 they were putting out into the air to try and really showcase the inequality of how a very few, very rich people are actually responsible for quite a large amount of emissions. And it's actually triggered some people quite hard. I don't know whether people here know Jordan Peterson. He's, I consider him to be a very bad human being. He's sort of a very, right-wing pundit. Anyway, he responded to the tool we built. He has a huge online following and called us truly evil, jealous, resentful totalitarians because we built this tool, which I take as a great compliment. So when people like him tell us this sort of stuff, that's always lovely to hear. And this way of sort of looking at my own work, I know this is in German, I'm going to translate, also led me to probably the biggest project of my career so far, which was that during the COVID-19 pandemic, I found myself sitting at a dinner table with my family at the end of 2020, and we had just heard the news that the first vaccines would start to arrive soon, and we all had these questions about it. We asked ourselves, are they safe? When are they going to come? When is the pandemic finally over? All of these questions that I'm sure many of you were discussing with your families as well. And because there wasn't much knowledge available at the time, I sat down and I built a little website, which is usually what I do when I try and solve a problem. I try to build a website, and I took all of the data that I could find in various press releases and so on, and built a little vaccination dashboard where I tried to show, okay, what are the numbers, how many people have been vaccinated so far, and just put this on Twitter, and I said, I built this, maybe this is useful to someone. And then I got an email 2 days later from the Austrian Ministry of Health saying, well, we looked at your dashboard, could you give us a call? And I was slightly taken aback. I thought I'd maybe done something wrong or stepped on someone's toes. But then I gave them a call, and then I spent the next 4 days and nights building the official Austrian COVID-19 vaccination dashboard with the Austrian Ministry of Health. It was actually a project that encompassed more than a year and was one of the most visited websites in Austria at the time because, of course, this was sort of news day in and day out at that time. And I then helped build data visualizations that were hopefully accessible to a very large audience, literally the whole population. And we did some things that I'm still very proud of, like actually make all of the data in the background available as open data so that anyone could work with the data and could actually look at the data. We also, for the very first time, showed non-binary people in official Austrian statistics and a whole bunch of other things that this very dinner table idea with my family led me to. And this may be an example for how you don't always know when you first start working on an idea where it leads you, but sometimes it's helpful to just trust the process. And if you build something for yourself or for your close ones, then maybe other people will find it useful too. But the more I did this work, of course, this is design work, right? I did have to think about colors and typography and all of these things in those projects. But I also found myself more and more sitting on tables and sitting in rooms with policymakers, for example, or with campaigners, or with data scientists, all kinds of other disciplines. And I found these disciplines very exciting as well. And I started sort of diving out a bit into sort of beyond what most people would, I guess, consider traditional design work. And over the last 2 years, I was also a youth delegate at the UN climate change conferences for Austria, which led me to sit in sort of weird conference rooms like this one and speak to politicians and say what European youth is advocating for and work with other European youth from across Europe to craft these joint positions. And yes, I did design the policy brief, but really my design work in that was very limited. It was mostly work in the field of politics. Or as was mentioned before, I co-founded Climate Dashboard, which is a German and Austrian website where we try and visualize climate data. And yes, this is design work, of course. We choose color scales and we try to work with typography in a way that makes sense, but we also build visualizations in three-dimensional space, and we give talks and all of these things. And last but not least, I got to be in the jury for Next Gen Design Awards because I'm on the board of Design Austria, which is sort of Austria's collective of designers, which is actually turning 100 years old in 2 years. So it's a very old thing, and we try to bring it into sort of the 21st century with the board that we're assembling right now. And all of this work, design doesn't, I spend so little time in design programs nowadays. I spend much more time doing some of these other disciplines that I showed before. And I'm not someone who advocates that sort of designers should do everything and that we have it all figured out. Because it is very important that we work with experts in these various fields. But I think it is very important to consider the work that we do, not just as sort of work within a box that just is within the design box. But actually, I think more and more with the crises in the world that we see, we hit the edges of these boxes. And I'm sure some of you are familiar with this feeling in your own work where you design something or you come up with an idea, but then you realize actually to put this into practice and to make this successful, it needs policy making, it needs other people. And my encouragement is just to not think about design in that box anymore. Which brings me to a sentence that I found in the invite of this very talk, which I loved, and thank you to whoever wrote it, which is, design is not neutral, it reflects who we are and where we want to go. And I think this is so crucial because there are some people who say, design shouldn't get too political, design should just, do what it does best, make, pretty functional things and so on. But I think by its very nature, design is always political. And design is never neutral. And if someone doesn't believe this and you want to prove it to them, one of the examples that I always point people to, and this now brings me away from my own work, but the work of some others, is this case, which some of you might be familiar with. Some of you weren't born yet when this happened. This was during the 2000 US presidential elections. And there were two main candidates. As you know, the US is mostly a two-party system. The one candidate was the Republican one, George W. Bush, and the Democratic one was Al Gore. Now, someone in Palm Country Beach, Florida, was tasked, they weren't a designer, but they were tasked with the job of coming up with a vote sheet. And the way voting worked is you had to sort of punch cards and punch down where you wanted to vote. Now, the way that they constructed this vote sheet is that on the very top you had a Republican candidate. And most people then thought that if you punched the second hole, you would vote for the Democratic candidate, which is what you'd expect. But actually, when you punched the second hole, you voted for a candidate no one really had ever heard of, which was a candidate from the Reform Party. Now, you might think, well, this doesn't matter much. The US is a big country, and this doesn't really change anything, right? Well, actually, the 2000 US presidential elections was the closest US presidential race in history. And they couldn't come up with a result for the 30 days after the election. It actually came down to the state of Florida that decided over the whole election. And it came down ultimately to this design decision because there were thousands of votes that were cast for the wrong candidate. They couldn't change it, but there were thousands of votes cast for the wrong candidate because of a design decision. And historians now looking back say that voters who meant to vote for Gore-Lieberman, which was the Democratic candidate, ended up voting for Mr. Buchanan. All else being equal, that would have been enough to decide the election. Now, we know what this led to. This led to the election of George W. Bush. This then led to the Iraq War. It led to Al Gore not being president. We know that might have changed a few things regarding climate change. There's a whole thing that this one design decision then triggered. This is maybe an extreme example, but if anyone ever tells you that design is limited in its capacity to change the world, then just point them to this example, and hopefully the discussion ends there. Fellow Austrian designer Viktor Papanek had a very strong quote in one of his books, Design for the Real World, which reads, "There are professions more harmful than industrial design, but only a few of them." Now, whenever I put this to industrial designers, they look at me slightly bewildered because, of course, they consider their work to be hopefully, world-changing to the positive, and hopefully it is. But of course, when we look back at what many design decisions over the last few decades have caused, where that sort of endless consumerism and the endless waste that then produces, I do think it's fair to ask, well, has design actually been a force for good in the past, or has it been a force of evil? When we look at, for example, how homeless people are treated by hostile architecture. When we look at AI systems and how they actually strengthen stereotypes, when we look at how AI perceives, for example, the gender of various jobs or the skin color. All of these are examples of design not being neutral. And I think we need to consider this in all of the work that we do. I know many of you do this anyway, but I just want to point it out again. And I think this notion of design being apolitical, we should disregard with this entirely. In fact, design can help us imagine a whole alternative future. And I love this example. This is from my hometown of Vienna. It's one of the big sort of crossroads and how it looks today. And this is how it could look in 2045. This is a visualization by a collective called the Wire Collective. And they do these sort of real utopias. They take real places and they try to envision what they would look like in a net zero world. Now, what's interesting about this image is that, sure, some of you will look at this and say, okay, it's maybe slightly too utopian. This is unrealistic. But actually, when I put this to people, whether they are conservative, whether they're liberal, whether they are Greens, whether they vote for right-wing parties, whoever I put this to, they usually consider this to be the better city than this one. Like, when you look at this, this just creates a feeling of, I want to live there. This seems nice. And this way of actually having design, I'm going to come to the donuts in a second, having design sort of show what the world could look like, I think is also a very powerful tool that we have at our disposal. And this brings me, speaking of nice things, to donuts, because I'm sometimes asked, like, how as designers are we meant to think about the world and the work that we do? How do we actually measure whether the work that we do is beneficial for the planet and for the people on it or not? And donuts are a great way of looking at this. In fact, there's an economic theory created by Kate Raworth, which is literally a donut theory of economics. And the donut has a so-called safe and just space for humanity. And it's defined by reaching, on the minimum, a social foundation. So making sure that we reach sort of peace and income inequality and health for everyone and food security and energy provision and all of these sort of basic human needs that we would consider to be central to modern civilization, while at the same time ensuring that we are not crossing the ecological ceilings that our planet provides us with. And you might have heard some climate scientists speak recently about sort of the planetary boundaries, where we do know that there are certain boundaries that we must not cross as human beings to ensure that our planet remains livable for us as humans. And between those two borders is what the donut sort of visualizes. And this is ultimately where we should place not just our political and economic systems, but hopefully our design work as well. We should think about it as advancing the social foundation while also making sure to adhere to the ecological ceilings. And in fact, you can then, I love data visualization, so I just had to put this in the chart as well. We can then visualize where different countries rank on their sort of getting to the donut. And this would be the ideal donut, meaning, this is slightly hard to read, but this doesn't cross any planetary boundaries on this axis, but also reaches all of the social boundaries on this axis. This is the sort of ideal donut. And you can see very clearly that no country on planet Earth actually reaches this. In fact, you can see there's a very clear parallel between when you enable people to reach the social thresholds, you do tend to cross more of the planetary boundaries. There are some countries which are fine examples of actually moving beyond this general trend, Costa Rica being one of them. But one of the jobs, I think, for us as a new generation, of a future generation, is to try and push more countries up to the top left and actually setting the example that this doesn't necessarily need to be a trade-off. I love this quote by Tony Cadabambera: "The role of the artist is to make the revolution irresistible." And I think this goes for designers as well. Whatever tools we use, I think if we do our job right, people will look at our work and be like, the world could be a better place. And actually, I am going to join these people in working on actually making that a reality. We design for futures that we want to live in. And this, last but not least, brings me to sort of us young people and the job that we have in all of this. I'm not one who is a huge fan of sort of making generational divides. I really think all of the problems of the world need to be solved in unison, and we can't really afford talking about young and old people that much. But I do think that resisting and repairing broken systems is something that we as young people probably feel a slightly different urgency to than some other people do. I personally was brought into politics by the climate marches that happened a few years ago in my country and many others. And they made a very important point, which is this sort of disconnect, right, between first the power that we give to young people in our political systems right now, which is very little, and the effects and the effects that we feel of the political decisions taken today as young people, which is quite large, right? Because we'll still be on this planet for quite a long time, hopefully. There's one of those disconnects. The other disconnect, of course, is saying, hey, you should go to school and learn all of these things. You should learn about science. You should learn about social justice and all of these things. But then when it comes to making political decisions, we actually disregard some of that science and actually do a whole different thing. There are all kinds of disconnects. And I think as young people, we have more tools available to us than ever before, right? I mean, this is something that older generations will sometimes tell us, that they came up with all of these wonderful tools. But of course, we know that, yes, these tools are amazing and they give us a lot of options. They also give us a lot of options about where to go in life, which doesn't necessarily make things easier. And the tools themselves are not necessarily just good as well. I mean, we know this when we look at social media, for example. Sure, this tool has been a tremendous force of change in many, many parts of the world, in many periods of time. It also has created huge mental health problems among young people, for example. And this goes for many other tools as well, right? The steam engine has brought tremendous welfare and tremendous efficiency, and we wouldn't be here and live this life if it wasn't for this invention. But if we know what it did with the ecological boundaries of the world, we know it is not just one good invention. And we have got a lot of crises to solve all at once. This is just one other protest sign that I love, which is this, again, this notion of, well, are we actually listening to the people that we are sort of told are the people we should learn from? I think it's very important to make the point that we live in a complex world, right? And if we do design right, we embrace this complexity rather than try and control it. I was always taught in design school that as a brand designer, you're meant to give very strict corporate identity guidelines to clients, because if you don't, then they'll abuse your logos and all this good design work that you do. And there was always this sort of notion about try to control it, try to make sure everything fits to a grid, everything fits to a system. I actually have started to disregard this entirely in my own work, because I feel like the complexity is actually where the magic is. When people start interacting with your work in ways that you yourself never expected, then that actually breeds wonderful things. And so I think we really need to design in a way that revels in this complexity of the world. Secondly, I think, and I know it's slightly ironic because many of you are here because you won a competition, congrats again, but I do feel like competition is actually not what is going to get us to solve the problems of our world. It's important to celebrate great design, and I want to do this with all of you and your great design work, but ultimately I think what will change the world is working together and actually sharing ideas openly. Copyright is not going to bring us out of the crisis of our world. It's the free sharing of ideas that will, I think. And thirdly, ultimately, I love aesthetic things, right? I love doing pretty beautiful design work, but if it's not rooted in a strong ethical and moral foundation, I think it's no use. And I think this should always be the baseline of our work. Anyway, this was sort of a wild ride for different thoughts and work streams that I've followed over the last few years. Design is never neutral. Let's design the futures we want to live in, and let's design to resist and repair the broken systems of our world. This is what I wanted to put to you, and I'm more than happy to now learn from all of you and the work that you do. I just want to celebrate all the great people and the courage in this room and across this country again as we end. So thank you for listening to me.